you. Hi, everybody. My name's Victoria. I'll be moderating this session with three wonderful women from all around the world, actually, which is super exciting. And I want to talk to them, but the camera is here, so this is really weird. Okay, so I will just give a short introduction to each of our speakers just before you start your talks. But I've done some kind of Google searching, kind of stalking you a little bit to find a bit out about you. So it might not be that accurate, so I'm going to kind of introduce you, and then if you also introduce yourself and correct my introduction, and then give the paper, that would be excellent. So if we can start with Yenny Delgado, is this okay? Yeah? Okay, great. Yeah. So Yenny is from Peru, but you're also Native American, is that right? And she is a licensed psychologist and an elder and a session member of the Presbyterian Church of the USA. She's got a BA in theology, a Master's of Arts in Cooperation and International Development from Castillo de la Plana in Spain. And now she's just finished another master's degree as well, a Master's of Theological Studies. And Yenny's paper today, and she's also coming to speak to us today as the founder and the director of Publica, which I think she can tell us a little bit more about before you start speaking, and that would be really good. And her title is The Implications of Colonialization and the European Message in Abya Yala. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I think we have 5 minutes. Right? That's right.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I will do quickly if I can. You can see my screen.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Good. Yeah, I want to talk about the implication of the European Christian message in Abya Yala. As you all hear, part of my background. Actually, right now, I'm a PhD candidate of psychology of religion from the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. And I'm working about this implication as a part of my research and what is our identity. I want to start with the definition of Abya Yala, that everyone can be aware what it really means. It's Guna language that means land in full maturity and land of bitter blood. Is that unified name that we are using almost 40, 50 years to talk about the continent, the whole continent, not the European or the colonization division between English speakers and Spanish Portuguese speakers. Based on this definition, I will introduce you to a different world, because now from Abya Yala native people and their descendants like me are aware what happened during colonization. In the beginning, it was introduced, and even today, I grew up listening that kind of statement: speak to me in a Christian language. Háblame en cristiano. These both English and Spanish are European languages, right? Based on that, telling to native people, speak to me in a Christian language means you need to be a Christian, convert to Christianity, speak what I understand in Spanish, like in my case, or the case of my family. Others will be Portuguese, and people for the North in the United States, Canada will be in English. But native people, and here I want to introduce another concept about native people of the Quechua descendants, who I identify with, we will answer, Manan Yachanichu, means I don't know your language. But then later, after 500 centuries, we will answer, Manan Simikitaja Rinam Manchu, means I don't want to speak your language. Even I can speak, right? English or Spanish or Portuguese. That kind of message was introduced from the beginning. And the implication of that was really that a long history of native population in the continent full of life, destruction of and privatization of our motherland, the destruction of the nature was part of these implications. but also oppression against the native population, right? That all these implications have a consequences, right now we can see the intersection between this message and how the destruction of the land can be also affected. Because in the beginning, native people was living in harmony, was living in working with the land, be the best agricultures in our whole world, and then coming to the destruction of the land, and that have bring from what we hear maybe in Europe more and more, the doctrine of discovery, especially the Pope in March decided it's no longer a doctrine of the church, but was a theme for 500 years. Really means they will have the church or the kingdoms in the time proclaim, be the owners of the land and convert other people who are not Christians. When the Europeans arrived, Christianity and was imposed, and there was an intersection with what we call white superiority, white supremacy, and decided to advocate for take control of the territory. The territory for us is the motherland, and it means take control of what is around nature, people, resources, everything. To create it, not only we went through a genocide, physical genocide, we also get paper genocide, who means birth certificates, changing to say people are from Peru, Brazil, Guatemala. They are not native. They will have a Christian names, a Christian or European last names, and decided to change in papers the visibility of native people in Abya Yala. Another one, border schools, is well documented in Canada and United States, what happened with the Catholics and then Protestant schools to convert children to the new language, also to a new religion in the 20th century. And that is an example of how Christianity was imposed, people was changing the culture, taking away for the parents, for the family, and we have a new generation of people without identity. This is the other implication that happened too in different countries, in Peru, in Bolivia, because that kid was taken from the families to be the servants of the rich families during colonization and post the republics. Finally, the motherland be affected because the what we call the ancestral memories are getting lost between families, generation to generation, and we have a struggle right now to protect the land, protect the resources that we have in Abya Yala. I think it's my 5 minutes. Yeah.
Yenny, that was so rich. Thank you so much. So next I'm going to call on Anna Perkins. So Anna is faculty at the University of West Indies. Her work spans from social ethics to LGBTQ theologies, business ethics, culture and ethics, environmental ethics, obviously, that's why she's here. And she has a BA from University of West Indies in Jamaica, an MPhil from here in Cambridge, and the PhD from Boston College in the US. And Anna's paper is called "For Us, It Is a Crisis, Mia Motley and the Caribbean Revolt Against the Climate Crisis." So welcome, Anna. Thank you for joining us.
Victoria, thank you very much, and thanks to everyone for having me. Just one quick correction. I'm adjunct faculty. My full-time work is actually in administration, which is part of what has taken me to Antigua this week. So thank you very much. All right. So in addressing various publics on the matter of the climate crisis, one of the most important groups we focus our attention on are political leaders. Yeah, we do this because we recognize the importance of their role in shaping policy and practice that fuel and maintain the climate crisis. So as a Caribbean woman, Jamaican, it wasn't hard for me to decide to take a look at Mia Amor Motley as the first female prime minister of the island of Barbados, the world's newest republic. We call her in the Caribbean very affectionately Mia, and she has a really important platform, national, regional, global. She has a presence and she has a voice. I think there are very few people who pay attention to what's happening in COP, the various COP gatherings, 26, 27, Summit of the Americas, and so on, who have not encountered her voice and what she has to say in ways that are deeply meaningful. And you find that people take snippets of her speeches and they're circulated by WhatsApp and all of that kind of thing. And she really has engaged the world and sparked quite a bit of interest in the Caribbean region and interest in what we're experiencing and what's going on. Of course, we want to go beyond interest. We want her voice to be heard, to bring about some kind of action as she talks to us about the climate crisis, which she states quite clearly is not about climate change. So she pushes back on that very sort of meaningless term that, you know, pulls the real import and the real emphasis that's needed in talking about crisis, climate crisis. And she talked about it as the experience of the people of the Caribbean and the global South. She's inspired by the liberative dimensions of our Caribbean religious, spiritual traditions and the revolutionary dimensions of our Caribbean culture. So you'll notice that a lot of times she speaks, you'll hear her referring to Bob Marley, and she does talk about herself as an apostle of Marley. She'll refer to the songs of Jimmy Cliff and others. So she's very clear that the cultural traditions of the Caribbean, which are undergirded by our spirituality, have something to say in particular about what's happening in the climate crisis. So she talks too about there being this moral cavity, which has to have some kind of spiritual response. She says we need a new spirit to fill this moral cavity, which is being expressed by how we treat with the climate crisis, by putting profit over people's lives, people who are on the front line, people in the Caribbean and in the global South who are on the front line of this climate crisis. And we are ignoring the impact of the climate crisis on the lives of peoples and individuals in ways that are actually as destructive for the ones that are putting profit at the forefront and ignoring people. And she does try to make that case. So what she does is that she denounces the old imperial order, which she points out has created significant inequalities, particularly the financial architecture on which the world runs. And she's known to be particularly nerdy and able to understand all the financial jargon and to be able to put it out there in a way that ordinary people like myself can understand a lot better. So she's not taken up with jargon, but she understands financial instruments and so on, and can make the case as to why the way the world is set up financially is actually impacting the climate crisis and impacting the lives of the vulnerable in the Caribbean in particular, in the global South, because we therefore don't have the ability to respond when we are faced with climate crises that are not of our own making. Yeah. So she calls too for us to revolt against discriminatory practices that are against the smaller nations such as Barbados and Jamaica, and where the larger countries in the world can go ahead and make financial rules that impinge on what happens in the global South without the global South having the ability to participate, having a say in what happens, and continuing a discriminatory financial architecture that never envisioned the global South and decolonization as would have happened after the Second World War. So she does talk to us about three interrelated global crises: the climate crisis, the pandemic of microbial resistance, and she's on a global committee that looks at that. And then she's also very concerned about the debt and the economic crisis. And she said that those of us in the global south are particularly vulnerable because we face this double jeopardy. The developing world developed by extracting from the developing world. And when they gave us independence, they left us in a state where we weren't even able to finance the basics of education and health and housing. And when they extracted from us and went into the Industrial Revolution and so on, what they did do was to actually start this climate crisis, which is now coming back to us, and we're vulnerable in ways that we're not able to resist the impact of the climate crisis. We can't rebound as effectively. We can't rebuild as effectively. And then you're in a financial space that is against you, that is unequal. So the terms for borrowing are higher for you and more stringent. There's not a recognition that you're already starting on the back foot and so on. So she talks about post-colonialism barely having had the chance to take hold before it had to give way to climate colonialism. So for her, reparatory justice is central to the call that she's making to repair the gaps that have been created by colonialism, and that its current incarnation is climate colonialism. She's calling for solutions that are participatory. So we all need to have a voice. And, you know, she has this image of the folding chair that she brings to the table, which I just find to be absolutely fascinating. She's aware of her role and her purpose. She recognizes that as a political leader, her time may well be short. And so she's going to do what she can in the time that's given to her to make her case, to continue to make her case until someone hears and someone responds and reacts. Thank you very much.
Wow, Anna, thank you. Wow, what two rich presentations so far. Okay, so our final speaker to be introduced is Arianne van Andel, who is speaking to us as the, where's your name gone? As a coordinator of theology and the environment in Otros Cruces. She's a Dutch theologian of the Reformed tradition, a feminist and a specialist in the areas of theology, ecology, ecofeminism, coaching, languages, and culture. And she also has a book published in 2020 called Theology in Movement, Eco-Theological and Feminist Essays for Times of Change. And today her paper is called To Hope or Not to Hope. So welcome, Arianne.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for this presentation. And also I'm very honored to be here together with Anna and Jenny on the panel and with all of you. After a very concrete sort of thing, I'm going to a bit more of a conceptual paper, or present it, To Hope or Not to Hope, with a wink to Shakespeare, of course. In the discussions about the multiple crises that we are facing, hope as a concept for me seems to be in crisis. So in this paper, I'm looking at what does hope mean now with such an obscure future ahead of us. Because in a lot of the sort of lectures that I give and all that, people ask at the end, is there any hope left? And that question in general sort of means, is it possible that everything is going to be all right? And it's exactly that expectancy in the question for hope that makes it so ambiguous to me, because I don't know what to say, not to comfort and paralyze. And that's what made me sort of start looking into the concepts. Bruno Latour asks for a radical abandonment of this kind of hope. So I feel we need to rethink it and question its colonial and paralyzing interpretations. In philosophy, hope has been seen as opium of the people and as the source of rebellion, as an ally, or as an opposite of utopia. So we have Bloch on the one hand with Aristotle, and we have Nietzsche on the other. So it's very interesting to look into that. And Terry Eagleton has written a book that's called Hope Without Optimism, where he radically questions the connection that we make a lot between hope and optimism. He says there is a sense in which optimism is more a matter of belief than of hope. It's based on the opinion that things tend to work out well, not on the strenuous commitment that hope involves. In hope, there's anticipation, desire for change, and it intends on the possible. Hope always has a rational component in that sense, although the odds are against it. If hope mobilizes or paralyzes is a question of utmost importance in Christianity, as hope is one of the three main virtues of our belief, together with faith and love. In my essay, I compare Jürgen Moltmann's Theology of Hope and Joanna Macy's book, Active Hope. Yeah, although they are from different times and different traditions, I found it interesting to have a look at them both. Moltmann, as a Protestant theology from the post-war era, who inspired liberation theology in Latin America and worked a lot later on the care of creation. And Macy as a Buddhist ecologist and activist from the US. Moltmann puts eschatology and hope at the center of the Christian belief. He says, from first to last, hope, Christianity is eschatology, is hope, forward-looking and forward-moving, and therefore also revolutionizing and transforming the present. Moltmann says that God himself comes to us from the future, sort of opening possibilities where we don't see them anymore in active hope. So God is not over us, he says, or only in us, but only just before us in the future. For Moltmann, this hope collides with everything we experience in this world. It is hoping against hope, like the promise in the biblical narrative. For the promise of a new creation in peace and justice in Jesus Christ, we don't see it yet. It's the not yet that he stresses. This kind of hope is in constant tension with the world that we live in and creates an unquiet heart, as he says. Hopelessness, for Moltmann, in that is at the essence of sin. So he feels that if we don't hope, that sort of part of the sinfulness is the not trusting in God's future. With his view, he puts the responsibility for the climate crisis in human hands. And on the other hand, I found it quite an anthropocentric view. It reveals a certain dualism between moral right and wrong in nature that may be complicated in our context. How do we protect a living world that we feel is in contrast with God's promise? How do we value and conserve nature if we feel that God cannot be found there? And what is caused by God now and what by humans? It's a big question now in the Anthropocene. Another problematic aspect in Moltmann's view is that the eschaton in the future is easily associated by us with a belief in a better future in the terms of, is it going to be all right, of progress and growth. Moltmann's theology, as found in Theology of Hope, rejects the sacredness of nature and doesn't conceive circular time, which is one of the big differences between Christianity and worldviews of indigenous people. Macy, on the other hand, in Active Hope, complements Moltmann for me in that she highlights the importance of narratives in hopeful action. So she doesn't say that this is it. She says that hope is not so much a result or a future outcome as it is an option for a different story. Hope is mostly a choice for a narrative about all the alternative ecological actions that are already taking place, not the certainty that that story will prevail, that it's going to be all right. Where Moltmann describes despair as sin, Macy offers a different view on managing emotions. She honors the pain that we feel about the destruction of the environment, and as we are an integral part of the web of life, she says that this pain is the earth crying out through us. As he should suggest, we practice gratitude also for what already is hopeful and good in the here and now, very Buddhist. That's for her a basic of hopeful action. And this space in Moltmann's view seems limited as the focus on the not, it's not sufficient and it needs to change, which is, I think, a very Western and Protestant focus, critical and eager to denounce, but not so useful to re-nurture our connection with the earth and all the ecosystems. When in Latin America, I see, to conclude, those two views combined in the environmental groups and women groups and indigenous people that I work with. We are very much aware of the colonial and unjust patriarchal power structures, as my other colleagues already told, and the suffering that the climate crisis already is causing for vulnerable communities. But we also celebrate what is good in everyday life now and then, and create new, inspiring, contagious narratives. We need to translate this story of resurrection into tales of hope for the future. That is different from churches that tend to fatalism and embrace chaotic and destructive forces as apocalyptical signs of the desired coming of Christ, which happens a lot still in evangelical churches, also in Latin America. But it's also different from the deep adaptation movement in Europe, who opts to prepare for collapse and take that story as a reference. Active hope, more than preparing for or controlling future outcomes, I think is the possibility to contribute to a different story and put all our forces in the hope that that will prevail. Thank you.
Wow, thank you all three speakers. So we have quite a lot of time now for questions, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll just speak to fill the space whilst you all think. Whilst you were all speaking, I was taking back, in the first year of my PhD, I read a biography of Saint Columba, who is one of the earliest missionaries. He's actually a very bad missionary, who came to Scotland in 6th century. David, he was a really bad missionary. So he was the abbot of a monastery. In the monastery, the other monks were really good missionaries, and he was really rubbish, so he stayed behind, and he didn't actually.
Oh, steady on, steady on.
Anyway, so the point of why I bring this up is in this book, it talks about how we look now at Celtic tradition and we romanticize the lands, like how the monks loved the land, and it can be a little bit fluffy. David, do you agree? Celtic stuff, Celtic theology can sometimes be very fluffy. And what this book went back is it said that no, they were in complete fear of the environment. Like Iona is this tiny Hebridean island, and if you've ever been there over winter, it's absolutely brutal. Sorry. So I think as I was listening to these three presentations, I think it occurred to me how in the West we're so comfortable in our shelteredness from the environment that we think controlling it is normal. And I just was really taken by like the urgency to act and like the kind of uncomfortableness in all of the presentations that our relationship with the land also needs to be in reverence and fear of the land.
Ah.
See, I got there.
Well, apart from needing to defend St. Columba, who got on really well with various different creatures and welcomed stray birds who are just getting to the island, I think I was beginning to pick something up from Arianne's talk, which is that both in my own training and when I've spoken subsequently to people who train Christian leaders, there is a shying away from the scary stuff. Even, dare I say it, when we had a gathering of URC ministers, our general secretary talked about the parable of the unfruitful fig tree and didn't push it beyond the point at which if you came back next year and there wasn't any fruit. We don't take seriously the ultimatums that there is such a thing as too late in the Gospels, in the good news that we're given. And also, again, we have a fear, perhaps in the more liberal churches, of doing anything at all with the apocalyptic stuff, which comes not in the marginal bits of Scripture, but in the Gospels, in the mouth of Jesus Christ, which you can, Arianne said those can be misused in a certain sort of literalism, but are also a spiritual response to crisis, which we ought to be able to do something more creative with. So that's a bit of apart from defending St. Columba, who was a great bloke, things to think about there. We are in a very scary time. What is there in our faith which can help us with that scariness, which isn't the optimism, which does you no good at all?
Any of our panelists want to respond or reflect maybe on each other's papers? If you see any similarities or differences or ideas that came whilst you were listening to the others?
Well, Arianne kept repeating, everything will be all right. And Arianne, you know that immediately that brings to mind Bob Marley, right? And his song, Every Little Thing is Going to Be All Right. And I think in one of Mia's presentations, Anthony Blinken actually quoted that song in response to her urgent call, her urgent message. And what you're saying is that there's a kind of gratuitousness with us quickly rushing to say, let's be optimistic, things are going to get better. Progress is inherent in what we're doing. So perhaps some of the destructiveness that's there in how we're treating with the environment is seen by some as sort of, casualties of war, if you want to place it like that, because eventually we think that needs to happen because things are going to get better. This is not only what the world is about and so on. So I heard immediately the resonances between Motley's position and what it is that you're saying. And I'm very taken with the whole notion of gratitude in the context of narrative, being able to tell our story and tell our story of gratitude, even as we attempt to face down the destruction that we're facing, as we attempt to face down the inequalities that are part of our experience as people that have been colonized and put to the margin. So I found your piece really, really engaging. And you say it's conceptual, but we do have to treat with deep concepts in order to make sense of what's happening here. Similarly, I read and listened to Yenny present on the whole notion of paper genocide, and I was really taken by that. Because we always can speak to the physical nature of genocide. You basically wipe out a people by literal murder or working them to death and all the diseases and so on. And we know that that's our experience in the Caribbean as well, even as we recognize too that the story of total genocide of the first peoples of our region is that exactly that is a story. And that there are resurgences of and reclaiming of that identity in very meaningful ways, even though speaking from a Jamaican perspective where we have people who have claimed their Taino heritage. We have a Taino chief that has attempted to reclaim the Taino language and so on, but they're facing down a Jamaican population that has been miseducated about the total genocide of those people, and a rejection, therefore, of any attempt to identify with them and to listen to the story that they tell in order to work us towards a solution based on the first people's experience. So, that's some of what I reflect on as I listen to both your papers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. See, I'm also, well, I think that what David said, sort of I really resonate with that in Western culture, in the North, in the places at least where there's not a real sort of very big impact yet of the climate crisis or of other crises, that people shy away from the scary stuff because they don't know about the resistance, the resilience that exists within human, our people, to be able to affront that. So what we try to do, and I include myself, is sort of to prepare for the worst, to prepare for what's coming, controlling the future. and also having these ideas of the future that it has to get better and that it has. But in Latin America, what I learned is that the resilience comes with creating other stories within the destruction. Sort of the indigenous people, well, Jenny can tell me more about that, but what I see in Latin America is incredible because they have survived. Some of them, not all of them, of course, but within all those destruction, they have survived. They are how do you say that? So recovering their identity. They are trying to, and that has been very hard, and it has gone through something that we need to recognize. And that's why I find this idea of Joanna Macy to honor and see the pain and the memory and the hardship, together with the gratitude for the resilience of everything that is already there, and not projected all to the future. Because if we as Christians sort of visualize the stories that are already existing and try and build the communities that we need to be able to resist, that is sort of the prophetizing action that we need, also with the denouncing of Moltmann, with the sort of saying to political leaders that they need to change. And I find Mia a very, very inspiring example, and I'm very glad that you sort of told more about us, Anna, about her, because that's also, that's sort of what I asked, is if she is taken into account in those international circles, more than sort of showing her videos and all that, if she has really been able to advance in some of those questions about the financial system and all of that, which I think is very necessary. But in the question of hope, I think that we need to sort of learn and balance the gratitude for the here and now, which is also very present in Paniker and other theological things about the eco-wisdom and eco-spirituality, together with those more future-oriented Christian perceptions that I found in Moltmann, and see how we can bring them together.
Yenny, do you have anything to add? If not, we have it. You do? Okay, good. And then
yes, yeah, definitely. I'm thinking about from the theological perspective. When I presented about how Christianity arrived, right, to Abya Yala, and we're thinking, is it the same Christianity that we are preaching today, or is not? If it's not, how change? Why the change? And why we need to be clear of something that in the beginning, Christians, and the Christian message, was like that, because they came to destroy, to commit genocide, to steal that land, privatize that land, divide it in big portions. This is why we have 35 countries in Abya Yala today, and make it rich to a group of people. And then from there, we have native population and the descendants, and people who practice. In the group of native populations, a group of people who practice, and they're indigenous. This is good to understand the definition, who are indigenous, who are native, and how both are part of the native community, are living in poverty. While we have struggled to have people without land, with the movement in Brazil, and they're basically native population who without a land, piece of land to produce their food to eat. For that reason, we're starving, and they're starving. Malnutrition kills kids, children, families. And we see all the environment, the decision from the beginning of colonization to today, how that theology killed the native population. And while it was not only physical, but then I mentioned the paper, who was really important to mention, because that one is like today we live with. Like a lot of people don't even know who they are in the world, because they don't have identity, because we lose the ancestral memories during 5 centuries. People start to say, we have an English last name, or a Spanish last name, or Portuguese last name, who I am in this context. Based on that, look very simple, but from the psychology perspective, being affected to don't recognize yourself, to do nothing about your environment. Why you will protect something that is not yours? Like all the time we receive that message. Is the government role, is whatever other people roles, but not my community, because I'm people without land, right? And that affected the psychological understanding also of our role as a Christians, if Native people identify as a Christian or not, but as a role in the community as a protector of the land. Well, it's important to mention that motherland is a concept central in the understanding of Native population, because the motherland means we are part of the land. That concept is very Christian. If we think about how Jesus coming from and defending a lot about what's their land, and talking about that, that message can be really applied for Native people too. But the interaction of economic understanding or interest for some group of people to divide the land and being owners of the land make a lot of communities struggle to have a piece of protection too. Like how is the role? And we expected, no, Indigenous people need to be in the jungle, Indigenous people need to protect the water. Like it's so much to carry. Like for thousands of years, Native people been that kind of work, but why we always put in the hands of someone who struggle with resources and with also with the idea of who they are in this world. For me, it's very inspiring, all brothers and sisters who even die to protect their land in Abya Yala. And we have many examples of Native people being killed only to protect the land, save the water. But now, how our Christian message be part of this? Like I even, as a theologian, struggle to, where is our Christian message to be part of this? And then we need to definitely talk and see from where. This is why for me in the last year working at Abya Yala theology, like coming from the land with thinkers and theologians of Native population who really care about these issues, is more productive than only we are working with European theologians based on the European thinking in another different context. Because if not, we always would have this struggle to copy a theology who is not part of our own history. And I know it's European, most of you are in the European context, but it's important to mention because you can have in mind how the European theology being affected the theology in Abya Yala too, right? And how can be productive for us to have this kind of conversation with you all and not feel separated from that conversation.
Thank you. So we have got a question from Zadie here.
Yeah, it was much more of a statement of affirmation really for Anna, but it was really to do with, it's also important about who writes our history. And sadly for the Taino people who were the first nations of the Caribbean islands, they get poor recognition because someone decided to say they were cannibals. And as a result of that negativity traveled with their history, and very little is recorded about them because their history was written by Europeans because they didn't have that ability to write things down. Their language was one of oral sharing, of drawings, of being connected to the land. And I'm glad you're in Antigua and that you've mentioned the Caribbean, because for us, when you look at where we are now, we're meant to be a land of wood and water, but in fact, because of colonization, half of that is gone. And our own history and where we come from has been written by someone else. And I think that as Christianity has come along, it's changed the way in which we view the land and our connection to the land.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, but this is not anything new. The whole idea that the interpretations that Christianity has given, for example, to the creation story in Genesis, where we take that whole notion of, you know, be fruitful, multiply, and translate subdue to meaning that we're not a part of creation, but we're lords over creation, and creation is meant to be exploited. And particularly when European Christianity saw some groups of people as less than human and more close to the animals, therefore they're also to be exploited for the benefit of the real human beings, the Christians, part of what Yenny pointed out in her theological response as well. And so that's part of why it's really important for us to have conversations like this, because I always think, you know, the conversation that we're having with our European colleagues oftentimes will be difficult for them, because it's unimaginable that they could be a part of this conversation and not somehow feel put upon, not somehow feel that the Christian religion that has shaped Europe, themselves as being European people, European descended people, whose ancestors we are standing and sitting around critiquing in very significant ways. You know, how do you not understand the kind of pushback that has come and is coming from all different spaces? But the important thing is that we recognize that what we're involved in is a dialogue and a reclaiming of our relationship, because there's brokenness. Let's face it, brokenness has happened between and among the various peoples of God in our world, Christian and non-Christian. And that brokenness is part of what needs to be repaired, as some nations claim the requirement for redress, physical redress in terms of, you know, the financing that's needed so that Antigua and Jamaica and Trinidad can really respond to the Category 5 hurricanes that have become the norm in our experience these days, not having to do with anything that we have done in putting greenhouse gases into the environment and so on, not having anything to do with the fact that we lack resources because the very land that's made of, you know, of wood and water has been cannibalized in order to develop somewhere else. We're just speaking truth, and speaking truth to power, and it's not intended to be divisive. It's not intended to be power over another, but really just saying this is what is. How can we work together? This conversation is not meant to be divisive at all. We're reclaiming our power to be able to tell our own stories, to write our own stories, just as Mia does. You know, one of the commentators on her work and so on said that she excels at shaming, public shaming, and yet she's able to do it in a way that still brings people along with her. And I know Arianne did ask me the question as to whether she is being effective or not. And sometimes you do feel that, you know, yeah, they're Laura on the stage. She is a very smart African descended woman. She's an important political leader in the Caribbean space. You know, even, you know, everybody wanted to take a picture with her, President Biden and so on. But so what after that? Aren't they really just dismissing what she has to say? Where has the change happened in terms of what she has been calling for? And I have that very concern as well. I do know, of course, that she has been very successful in negotiating some terms in light of the boring relationships for her country, and having put in the contract with the World Bank and so on, where there is some space that's given to Barbados in repayment for loans and interest and so on, should Barbados suffer from a climate catastrophe? Now, that's a huge thing that she has managed to negotiate. And if that could become part of the larger process of the financing of the developing world, I think she would have made some real strides in that direction. So yeah, she is sort of nibbling away.
Thanks, Anna. Thank you. There's a question here.
So we have
Maybe I could react to, there is a question in the chat by David where I would like to, but maybe there are more questions. I don't know.
That's okay. We can take David first and then we'll go here to Christy. We can pass on this one.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, that question. So where are we going to find our resources for what's going to happen? Which is actually sort of confirming what I said about the European way of looking at this. And what I've learned here, I'm living, I don't know if I told that, but I've been living in Chile for about 20 years now. So I'm sort of semi-Chile, I'm Chilandesa, they call me here, Holandesa and Chilena at the same time. But what I've learned here in Chile, a country that sometimes constructs things and then sees it all disappear because of big earthquakes also, that people live with that consciousness, but they sort of look for what is their force now? What is your spiritual resource? What are your spiritual resources now? Because the world is already a mess. And for lots of people, it is already a mess. So what are our spiritual resources in the European theology, if we are studying that in the European lands, the European natives that are also there, without romanticizing? I agree with that, because sometimes we feel that all the indigenous people were harmonious with nature and all that, which is not totally true either, maybe. And not all Christians that came were terrible. There were a few, there always a few, but there always have been counter reactions with Bartolomé de las Casas and Colombo and missionaries that saw that this was not the Christian message. So I think we need sort of to dive up all those voices that have a spirituality of the now, of connection, because what we need, what I feel in Chile that we need, is connection among all the different spiritual traditions. Try and go against that big tendency now to they, us, because there is a fundamentalist and sort of warlike environment. It is growing. We have to see that in Europe and everywhere. There are those groups that say, I'm going to have this all for myself and the rest can just die. Yeah, and that's what might happen with wars for water, for all the resources that are in danger. But there are also groups that try and create communities among and these sort of ways with the virtual connections that we can make by computer and all that are very good for that. So to connect and to find the people in our local areas and worldwide that are working on another story. And I think that we as Christians need to visualize that story and say that is what we want, although it might not happen. It might be that we need to be very humble and say maybe God has another idea of what's going to happen. We don't know what kind of darkness we have to go through before something else can arise. I don't know what the future is going to be about, but I know that I now want to work on a story that goes in the direction of communion, of harmony, of bringing people together. And that's the hope that I have, the hope that I'm living now. And what the future, how it will develop exactly, we don't know. But we are playing a part in it now. From now on, and every step that we take, we are taking part in it. And so that sort of catastrophe that's coming, yeah, it might be. and probably it will, we know, because of science, but we know that there are loads of stories working to change it also, and we don't know what's going to win, and we cannot say we have to prepare for this or that. We have to live now what we want to see happen, and that's what the change of that idea of hope is important for me.
So I think
it might be easier if you come to the camera. Oh no, it's moving now.
Well, just come.
thank you so much for those presentations. And in a sense, you are speaking, living some of the answer. And I think we need to take our theology and the rarefied atmosphere we live in within these theological consultations, and instead of living in the abstract, we need to make things practical. We need to move from theology to practice. And when Jesus says to the rich young ruler who asked, what should I do to inherit eternal life? That example is our model. And I think what we have to confess at this consultation is that we know that the last stage of colonialism is that the colonialist becomes the savior again to finally preserve what they have destroyed. And we need to step outside of that dynamic. We need to confess it because it's the psychodynamics at work, the power at work. We need to confess that even here and now, to say that our role, we have the money, we have the power to give to you, to empower your voices, to create the books, to create the theology, to create the films that bring hope, that bring the answers. We have the answer, we have the money, we have the power, we have the wealth. Part of our process is the confession, the repentance of walking humbly, doing justice, loving mercy and doing justice. And part of the doing justice is to give our power and our wealth away rather than cling to it, which is the traditional model of colonialism, when the last stage of colonialism is to become the saviors again.
No, I'm not sure that's the thing that needs to be responded to. I just saw lots of nodding and affirmation. So I think that's good. So we've got Bernie on the chat. Bernie, do you want to say your question, or would you like me to read it?
You can read it, thank you.
Oh, okay. So Bernie says, for those of us who are convinced that the international financial and industrial systems needs to be radically transformed, Anna, can you summarize for us what is Mia Motley's proposal? What is for a good system to replace it?
Hi, Bernie. Thanks for that question. I did try to drop something in the chat sort of quickly to respond to your very, very pointed question. And what I understand of what Mia is proposing is that she wants a total revamping of the system so that everyone that's affected by the system participates in designing that system, so that we don't have former colonizers having more benefit than the formerly colonized and so on, although we recognize that neocolonialism continues, and of course her concern with climate colonialism and so on. So she's saying that the way the system is currently set up already disadvantages countries that suffer from these created vulnerabilities, this whole notion of the double jeopardy that she talks about that Caribbean countries and countries in the global south suffer from. So I think what she wants us to do is to recraft a system that sees everybody and sees everybody as equally participatory, and that, for example, financial terms of borrowing and lending don't get set by those that have more power to impose terms in terms, such as, higher interest rates for countries that are vulnerable with vulnerabilities that they have no control over. So you're penalizing us for something that we can do very little about. And in fact, what you ought to be doing is paying into a fund of for climate resilience to help countries such as ours to recover, given that the vulnerabilities that will totally destroy their economies. A Category 5 hurricane passes through and Jamaica is flattened, or as would have happened, Grenada and Dominica and other spaces would be destroyed because of what happened when developing countries were developing, both by extracting, but also how they developed. They developed in ways that were very destructive of the environment. And then that sort of redounds and turns around on nations that are more vulnerable. So, but my way of understanding her call for revamping is really about full participation and not having the kind of hierarchies that currently exist being replicated in ways that countries are penalized for their vulnerable status that they have very little control over. Yeah. Quick answer, Bernie.
Thank you. I can see the need for it and the importance of all participating in setting up the new system, but what could this system actually consist of? I know that Council for World Mission and other international partners had a series of consultations on a new international and financial and economic architecture, if I've got that title right. And I've not got to grips with what's come out of that set of consultations. I don't know if Kevin or others have got your fingers on it.
I think David McConaughey is really the right person to speak about that. He's taken on the role of economy and ecology. So he'd be taking that work forward, really. I'm definitely not the right person to be asked.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so we are out of time, but can I thank the three incredible women for their great presentation. It was such a challenge, and for me, I think the highlight are the ways that the three of you brought out how we should be occupying spaces where we're not welcome and welcoming alternative ways of thinking about the climate crisis, which I just think has been really, really helpful. Thank you so much. Thank you. And now logistics, Kevin.
Yes, okay. Box.
We next meet in 2.5 hours, so UK time, that's 7:30. Those of you online who can join us, it would be really great if you could come back and join us. We're hoping to have some open discussions, and it would be great to have you part of those. So that's 7:30 for open discussions this evening, our time.
The 7:30 BST.
Yeah.
For open discussion moderated by Robert. You're sitting over there next to the camera. So thank you very much, everybody, and we shall see you a bit later. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.